And distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, after our insightful keynote speech delivered by Bapak Rida, next let us start our plenary lectures. On this session, we're going to gain incredible insights, learning about the challenges as well as the opportunities on energy transitions roadmaps here in Indonesia. And ladies and gentlemen, so without further ado, please allow me to welcome Professor Benjamin Sovacool, the Professor of Earth and Environment of Boston University and the Professor of Energy Policy at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex Business School, who's joining us here online, known for his incredible work on social inequities in the transition to low-carbon energy sources, to deliver his presentation. So, Professor Benjamin, we're so happy to be connecting with you, and the floor and time is yours.
Actually giving this presentation live, but almost halfway around the world from the United States. So I get to do something today which I really like to do, which is to talk about energy transitions, as well as what they might mean, kind of global experience on various energy transitions for a country like Indonesia. So to begin with, it's really important when you talk about energy transitions always to define what they are, because there are lots of terms throwing around, transitions, transformations, and lots of different sectors. And I think that in the community of energy and climate scholarship, there's also a great diversity of what transitions are. And the first one is something that I think you see all the time. We've even seen it earlier today at this conference, which is that transition is really substituting energy fuels. So it's security of supply and changing natural gas to coal, or maybe renewable energy to nuclear power, or nuclear power to energy efficiency. And I think that the literature is quite dominated by these notions of changes in fuel supply. But this is not the only element of a transition. A second one is that you can actually change technologies that use energy services. So here we can have changes in things like refrigerators, or air conditioners, or automobiles, or boilers in factories, or assembly lines. So you can see already a kind of distinction that you can have supply-side transitions and demand-side transitions. However, even then, these aren't the only two ways that you can kind of conceptualize what a transition is. You can also switch the regulatory systems or the social architectures of energy. So good examples here would be a real push around the world for electricity restructuring, market liberalization, the unbundling of assets, which I know many Southeast Asian nations have done, and which the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank have promoted, where you unbundle transmission, distribution, and generation. And you can also have things like shocks, like the war in Ukraine, or the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had nothing to do with changes in supply or changes in demand, but shocked regulatory systems, so that you also had very rapid energy transitions. Finally, there's a whole other school of perspectives that talks about transitions as diffusion, as the time it takes in terms of months or years for a new technology, a new innovation, a fuel cell, small modular reactor, let's say a hydrogen-based boiler, to actually reach a certain market rate with early adopters and late adopters and laggards. And then you could say any of these types of transitions in technologies and end-use devices, regulatory systems, and diffusion can occur at a variety of scales, from cities like Jakarta to regions like Southeast Asia, all the way up to the globe. And the approach that we take in our research is often that energy transitions are all of these things. And all of these things can actually occur and shape whether or not we are achieving decarbonization and net zero or not. There are a lot of different conceptual devices in the literature, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because I know this is really about Pertamina's energy outlook, and it's really about the empirics of transitions, but I did just want to give you a taste for what some of the thinkers in the community say about how they theorize transitions. So Arnoff Grufler and Charlie Wilson have a great theory that is both spatial and temporal. So it is temporal in that it says that a new technology, a new transition begins with experimentation of small devices that then scales up to unit production, that scales up to industry production, that then has standardization, and eventually market saturation. And the spatial element is that these new innovations emerge in a core up to a rim and then a periphery. So they diffuse also over different spatial distances. And they applied their framework to big energy transitions here in Europe that you can see, where they talked about the phase-in of things like the steam engine and coal, and then later on the phase-in of things like crude oil or modern electricity services. And you can see how they diffuse, right, across space, where they may begin in England, but it takes up to a century for them to end up in Portugal. Another theory, and this is the only other one I'll talk about in depth, is large technical systems. This is a totally other take. This is the one that I actually used in my own PhD, and this is just about large technical systems and how large networks like electricity networks require not just technical devices, but a seamless web of economic policies, educational ways of knowing and doing research, legal rules, administrative norms that fuse together to create momentum and path dependence. And here you can see these systems also have a phase model where they can expand and grow and become path dependent, but also become reconfigured during contests and crises, and even stagnate and decline. And this framework of large technical systems is very useful in understanding a variety of different historical things, including electricity, but also shale gas, telecoms, flood control, railways, even mobility and transport networks. So it's a theory that has very large technical potential and explanatory power. And to give you a sense for just how many theories there are, we did a study where we interviewed theorists and we asked them, how many theories do you think there are to explain transitions? And the answer was 96. Yes, 96 theories, of which in the article we go through all 96 from a variety of disciplines: psychology, behavioral economics, management studies, history, and talk about some of the core theories that are frequently mentioned a lot more in the article. So this just also gives you a kind of lens into just the diversity of devices the Academy has when we think about transitions and changes in technology, practices, actors, expectations, even lifestyles and norms. So enough of that, and now to some of the real pesky issues that I think we're discussing here at this conference, which is about what can we learn about transitions and what might this mean for a country like Indonesia. So the first is I want to go back to this graphic, which I showed you earlier from Grubler and Wilson, but now let's look only at the diffusion speed. Even for these classic transitions, in a place that's fairly small, Europe, at a time where the new innovations had immense benefits to their earlier substitutes, the steam engine was seen as so much more advantageous than muscle power. And electricity and liquid oil and crude oil and refined gasoline and petrol were seen as much more viable than things like coal. Even though those things existed, you can see the speed at which it took them to become adopted was centuries to half a century, which has convinced some, like the geographer Václav Smil, to say energy transitions have been and will continue to be large affairs that will take huge amounts of time, and it makes them, look at this, impossible to accelerate, even if you resort to very strong economic incentives like carbon taxes. And this is data from Smil that's plotted two ways. These are the big three global energy transitions in our lifetime and before, and you can see the top just shows it by timeline and the bottom just shows it by the number of cumulative years, so it's the same data visualized two ways. And you can see that coal still took more than 80 years just to achieve a 5% share of total primary energy supply, and another 30 years to reach 25%. Oil took 80 years to reach 25%, gas took about 90 years, and nuclear power and the renewables aren't even close to reaching 25% of total primary energy supply, even hydroelectricity, which has been around for more than a century and a half. And then you can talk about diffusion, which I mentioned earlier, and you've got people that look at how long it has taken different innovations to diffuse. And what's interesting with this work is you look at both dimensions. So the formative phases, how long it takes for something new to be researched. So it's kind of pre-commercialization, things like prototyping and experimentation and demonstration. And on the right is how long it takes once it's actually been successfully demonstrated to then actually reach market acceptance, social acceptance. And so the true diffusion speed is both phases added together, and you can already see that some of these phases span centuries, and even fast ones still span decades. And this is only for individual innovations. It's even worse for systems of systems, where you have not gas-fired turbines, but an entire electricity grid that must convert and change, all the way from the coal mine to the transmission network, to the power plant, to the fly ash facility, and so to the transformers and all the other components of that system. So it's magnitudes of order more difficult to transition systems than it is for single technologies. Finally, another way to look at this is how long it takes not to transition something in, but how long it takes to transition something out that you may not want, like coal. And I'm quite fond of Bruno and Frank's paper here about the phase out or the destabilization of coal in the UK, where they've been trying to destabilize it intentionally since the 1950s, because coal was connected with air pollution and smog and debilitating health effects. And you can see here, this entire process, which has been driven by government, has also taken a century, with punctuated equilibria as coal goes up and down, up and down, up and down. And so this also is telling us that it also takes a long time for the flip side of transitions to occur. However, that perspective is not the only one. What you can see here is if you do look intentionally for fast transitions, this is not a representative sample, these are more extreme case studies. There have been at least 5 very fast transitions in terms of energy devices that use energy services. We call those prime movers. And there have been many fast national transitions where you have security of supply or the substitution of fuels occur. And you can see them here, whether it's the introduction of energy-efficient lights in Swedish office buildings or cook stoves in China. There's a very good Indonesia example here, which is LPG stoves, flex fuel vehicles in Brazil, air conditioning in the United States, and then you've also got 5 very fast changes in national energy supply, Kuwait, the Netherlands, France, Denmark, and Ontario. And what's amazing to me is you can see the second to right column, number of years. Some of these transitions, like flex fuel vehicles or crude oil and electricity in Kuwait, took 2 years and 1 year. So they took off incredibly fast. What you can also see, if you've got good eyes, is this box to the right where it says the approximate size of the population. These numbers really add up, and you actually get more than 900 million people have been shaped by these 10 transitions. If you plot them on a map, they look like this. So this kind of notion that fast transitions are impossible and most of us aren't seeing them is also false, because if you know where to look in certain situations, we have seen in our lifetime fast transitions that have affected almost 1 billion people. And we've picked up on this work more recently to look at the decarbonization of heat, and have found another 4 other case studies in Denmark, in Finland, and the UK, where we have seen rapid and deep transitions for heating systems, also in our lifetimes, affect another 310 million people, with things like solar thermal water heaters in China, or heat pumps in Finland, or the conversion from town gas to natural gas in the United Kingdom, where they actually went into people's homes in the 60s and 70s and converted 40 million different appliances to actually run on North Sea natural gas. This has led some of my colleagues, like Florian and Carolyn, to kind of say that these future transitions, these accelerated transitions, have fundamentally different drivers than previous transitions. This is hopeful, because it indicates that the underlying dynamics behind transitions are changing. And they pointed to 3 examples in their research. The first is that historical transitions have been kind of accidental, but future transitions can be planned. Second is that innovation ecosystems can work sometimes in unpredictable ways to even accelerate a transition. The example that they give is German industrial strategy for feed-in tariffs for solar energy manufacturing, actually catalyzing Chinese economies of scale, which the Germans didn't even intend to do, because it put about 100,000 German solar workers out of business. And so this is where you can actually see unexpected serendipitous accelerations in the diffusion of new devices. And finally, they had a lot of hope for the Paris Accord and the nationally determined contributions, which still have a global consensus towards decarbonization with binding net zero targets that are updated every 5 years, which does have almost every country in the world on board, except for a few like Syria and I think Russia. They are also indicating that we've got new policy tools that can also help us control transitions, like control policies or disincentivizing things, or the phase out of things like coal-fired power or automobiles or incandescent cars or gas boilers, all of which are proliferating around Europe. And finally, sticking with that definition of transitions from before, you don't have to necessarily change technologies. You can also change the fundamental business models. And you could also see a lot of incumbent energy providers pivot to actually provide not only energy services, but innovations and patents, maybe peak services and storage, maybe better analytics and predictive software, maybe things like financing and bonds, all of which energy companies can do alongside traditional energy services. And to give you a sense for just how fast some of these new innovations can occur, I'm always reminded about smart home technologies, where we cataloged 2 years ago more than 260 smart home technologies that depend on digitalization, many of which affect how we consume and visualize energy, gas, lighting, as well as integrated home energy solutions like Nest and Hive. And keep in mind that these smart home technologies, which operate by apps on a smartphone, would not even have been conceived of in 1990, because that's before we had the World Wide Web and before we had smartphones and before we had the internet. So in just 3 decades, we can go through radical changes in technologies that intimately shape how we can consume and put energy to work in our homes and factories and our commercial enterprises. So what does this mean for Indonesia? And what does this mean for the study of transitions and for designing? So I think it means that whether fast or slow does depend about how they're defined. So it does depend on whether it's energy or electricity, total final energy supply, total final energy demand. So always make sure you check different assumptions, as well as what authors say about a transition is when it occurs. For instance, some will say an energy transition occurs at 5%. Some will say 25%. That's Smil. Grubler and Wilson say 50%, right? My study was looking at going from 1% to 20%. So there are always kind of different notions and units that need to be unpacked anytime you actually want to talk about different transitions. Secondly, as I mentioned as well in the first bit of the presentation, there's no shortage of conceptual devices, frameworks, heuristics, analytical tools for how we understand transitions. We interviewed a few years ago 35 theorists and got 96 theories, 96 theories. And what does this mean for the study of transitions? Does it imply that none of those theories fit? If we need 96 different theoretical devices to explain one phenomena, maybe they're all wrong, and maybe there is no consensus? Or is this something that should be celebrated because it reflects the true breadth of intellectual diversity and the contrasting freshness of perspectives? If there's 96 different ways to interpret a piece of art, and 96 ways to interpret a book, and 96 ways to feel about music or food, should it also be no surprise that we have 96 different ways to think about something as important as energy transitions? My own take is that all of these different approaches are useful, but each one has a focus. And because it has a focus, it also has something that's out of focus. So in a way, there is no such thing as a unified theory of transitions. All are useful, but also in their own way partial and incomplete. If you're also looking for what types of theoretical devices people are using to study transitions are the most popular, according to our interviewees, it is the multi-level perspective on transitions and social practice theory. Social practice theory is about the kind of meanings, materialities, and competencies around how we use energy through things like cooking, sleeping, commuting, bathing, and so on. So the practice that we put energy to use on is important for its comfort and cleanliness, rather than, say,
because it's coal or oil or gas or LPG. And the multi-level perspective talks about niches, regimes, and landscapes and how they co-evolve to create evolutionary change in technical systems. So those two approaches are very, very widely used. As an editor, I edit a journal. I probably see an article that uses them every day. So I could see those of you in the room that like the scholarship of transitions kind of saying, I want to use these two tools because everyone else is, because there's a common nomenclature about them and understanding in the community as to what they mean. But I could also see you going the other way and saying, well, I don't want to use what everyone else is using. Maybe I should use some of the other 94 theories that aren't being used every day by transition scholars. The causes of the fast transitions that I talked about, the 10 transitions, the 5 supply side, the 5 demand side that affected 900 million people, are also very complex. One of the big causes was World War II. That's what convinced Charles de Gaulle to embark upon the nuclear renaissance for France, and it was the end of hostilities in the Middle East that enabled Kuwait to explore its oil and gas fields, which up until 1943 had been under attack. There was a rural famine in China behind their cook stove program, and the 1970s OPEC embargo is really what led to Denmark pursuing its wind energy and combined heat and power, and Brazil pushing its pro-alcohol program, which was a precursor to their flex fuel program. Only in one of those 10 examples did we see a purely demand-driven transition, and that was not towards sustainability, because that was air conditioning. One implicit conclusion from this point, which is uncomfortable, is that we have to have major crises to drive transitions. And those crises do have to be at the scale of world wars, famines affecting hundreds of millions of people, or global economic crises. However, and this is where it gets good, future transitions don't have to follow these rules of the past, right? They can be driven by these new active governance regimes where you have net zero policies and tariff border carbon adjustments and regulated asset model bases and a whole variety of other tools, feed-in tariffs, energy audits, carbon credits. And you can also phase out as much as you phase in. Previous transitions were kind of about abundance, but it could be that future transitions are about scarcity or storage, if you're talking about things like negative emissions. Previous transitions were about huge changes in supply, but now we may see huge changes in demand, right? Especially things like pandemics or very rapidly changing consumer preferences as maybe people start to have less tolerance for carbon-intensive energy services. Indonesia, I think, could benefit from this research because the historical record and all of this body of evidence does suggest they can stimulate strong transitions. There is almost a blueprint that most countries can adopt by harnessing policy mixes that do both phase in and phase out. So you phase in, say, energy efficiency, wind, solar, geothermal, potentially nuclear power, and you would phase out definitely coal and oil and possibly natural gas, depending on whether you're capturing methane emissions or not. That would at least start to create a net zero roadmap for Indonesia. And if you start to throw in carbon capture and storage, then gas could even play a much bigger role because you could start to capture its emissions or couple it to things like blue hydrogen. It does also imply that the best way to stimulate fast transitions is to simultaneously change demand and supply at the same time, right? You don't just do one. And you could even accelerate it further by changing institutions and markets as well as diffusion speeds. So this gets back to the whole socio-technical approach to transitions, which implies transitions are multiply technical, economic, political, and socio-cultural. So this would imply that you would want a policy mix that focuses on a portfolio of technologies. On the demand side, probably better cook stoves, better standards in buildings, perhaps battery electric vehicles, and definitely changes on the energy supply side, especially renewables, efficiency, maybe things like biofuels as well, palm oil mill effluent, and so forth. I think another key lesson, this is a very uncomfortable one, is that fast transitions do not occur by chance, right? In our evidence, only one of the 10 was demand driven, and that was just air conditioning. And none of them was driven by the market. They were all driven by either crises, which is not a good template, or by strong government interventions. And when you talk about the more recent study we did on heat decarbonization, all 4 of those heat transitions were driven by government from the top down. And I think the final lesson, and this is one for Indonesia and all, is that, these lessons from Smil and Grubler and Wilson and Giels and Turnheim are instructive, but the past does not have to be the prologue, and history does not necessarily have to be predictive. And with that, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Benjamin Sovacool, for the excellent, very insightful presentation. Also for emphasizing the importance for all of us to orchestrate the right roadmap of energy transition, especially on a national level. And distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, after the lecture delivered by Professor Benjamin Sovacool, and next one, it is such an honor for me to welcome this next figure. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Ari Kunchoro, the Rector of the University of Indonesia, to come up on stage and deliver his presentation. Bapak, so honored to have you here, and the time is yours.
Honorable Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'd like to thank for the organizer for allowing me to share my experience as researcher long time ago. Once upon a time, I was a researcher in microdata. Nowadays, it's called a big data, but it's actually the same. So I think what we got from Professor Sovacool is that in energy transition, it is important to look at the behavioral change at the micro level. It happens at the consumer side, user, and also in the supply side, electricity provider, and also electricity user. I was involved in the World Bank project from 2013 to 2020 about the greening of manufacturing. It was talking not about the macro data, but talking about micro factory at the plant level, how they can achieve, how can they reduce energy intensity. So what I'm going to present today is actually part of my experience looking at the micro data. But we also have to learn from the macro data, because what happened at the micro level, it will impact the macro, the country level. So I'm not going to use any forecasting method, econometric or whatever, because in the current situation with pandemic, with the geopolitical conflict, all data are messy. You can look at the oil price level. One day it jumps $6, West Texas Intermediate, and the next day it's going down by $6. How we can make a forecast? Whether we have a model to put that into analyze. I think Professor Sovacool has a good term, quagmire of methodology. We are not sure the causal effect. What is the cause? What is the effect? So I'm going to use more simple method to tell you what I have been observing about the macro impact of energy transition. First, we look at the Indonesian economy. We have the Solo model. This is probably outdated model in 1950, 1960, but it become popular again because what has been happening in the US and in the Eurozone country, namely the relationship between growth and inflation. Why? The world has been experiencing the pandemic right now. Perhaps we are in the tail of the pandemic, but because the mitigation of the pandemic required for the government to limit the mobility, the impact is in the economy. So if we look at the slide right now, right, at one point in 2020, Indonesia experienced a negative growth of 5%. Yeah. It is term, it is still smaller than Indonesia experienced in 1998, right? But anyway, it is a deep shock. But what is interesting is that in 2021, in the first quarter and in the second quarter, the economy practically back to the what we call steady state growth, solo model, about 5% a year. That growth has been happening, 5% growth, annual growth, has been happening since 2014, after the commodity boom. Yeah. So we used it as line of departure. If the shock make the economy growing slower, then what sector that we have to take care in order the economy go back to its track? Of course, we expect that the economy will overshoot, yeah, to compensate the undershoot, but over time, it will stabilize again in the long growth path. So by 2022, third quarter, the economy, next slide please, recorded 5.72%. No, before this. Yeah. Okay, and then before, in second quarter, 5.44%. It's slightly overshoot, but that will be required to compensate for the output loss. But what is also important is that how much inflation generated by that growth. It is higher than the one targeted by Central Bank of Indonesia, 3 minus plus 1%. But anyway, it's still manageable. And what we know today, the inflation is actually eased off to 5.45%, right? Cooling off. So the economy is cooling off. So going back to the energy transition, it is like a shock. So I think the term from Professor Sovacool is very inspiring. How to make orderly energy transition. We should not make a great shock to the economy. So we need to look at the sector, or actually the engine of growth of Indonesian economy. And it is very interesting because it emerged after the negative growth because of the pandemic. So next slide, please. There are 5 factors, 5 or 4, transportation and warehouse, accommodation and restaurant, trade, manufacturing, and information communication. So information and communication, I think that is the legacy of the pandemic, where we use technology online to settle the demand side and the supply side of the economy. We can order food now using Gojek, for example. We can order it online, right? But we can also go offline, right? And after the pandemic, the middle class actually start to go back to the market. This is what we call the pent-up demand. After 2.5 years, they stay practically they stay in the house, right? They now eager for new situation. And then go down. This is the kind of transition that we need. perhaps we have mini shock, 1 year or 2 years, but mild one, and then go back to the trend. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, next slide. This is what I just stated as the balance between the demand side and the supply side. The demand side, represented by consumer demand, export, and so forth, and so on and so on, and the supply side, represented by the GDP at the sectoral. But the data only published once every quarter, and then we need to wait for another 3 months for the data to be published. So we look at the early warning indicator that represent the development in the demand and supply side. So what happened after the increase of fuel price? The consumer confidence index, yes, it goes down for 1 month. But this month, I think we need to update this data, it's up again. And the good news is that although the data show the impact, it's above the threshold level. For example, consumer confidence index is still above 100. 100 is the border between pessimistic and optimistic. And the same thing for purchasing manager index, for manufacturing, the supply side. It's still above 50. So the good news, you have demand stable and you have supply stable. What is the result? Mild inflation. That's why the inflation in October, November actually is off. Right? Can we produce that if we have energy transition? The answer is very possible. Because in Indonesia, the energy transition first directed at the upstream, the coal-fired power plant. Right? So what happened at the micro level, at the plant level, and at the consumer level, we can wait. Yeah. We heard that from the government that they are going to give subsidy for the ownership of the electric vehicle. That's a good thing. But what happened with the industry, the firm that want to change their coal-fired plant to renewable one? Can they have access to the loan from the bank? Yeah. Of course, we heard that the G20 meeting produced a commitment to provide fund $20 billion to Indonesia. But that is at a very high level. What happened at the micro level? Yeah. Perhaps $20 billion is not enough. So we need more. So we need a policy. Monetary policy at the bank side, credit policy at the consumer side. Right? Right now, we know, I'm going to talk in Bahasa, ganjil genap. If you have electric car, you can ignore the policeman in the gage zone, right? Ganjil genap zone. Right? But probably that is not enough. Why? Because the initial purchase of the electric vehicle is quite high. So the average middle class cannot afford that. What happens if the government provides a loan? The question is next is whether the infrastructure for recharging available. I think from the beginning there is Pertamina with the electric plug, right? Yeah? But how widespread? For example, I went to travel to Telomoyo in Magelang using electric vehicle. Can I hook up at my motel, not hotel 5-star, motel? So that is from the end user. But from Professor Supankol, we have to be patient. Passing out, passing in. Okay? It may not happen over time. And I think Indonesia is on the right track because it chose the upstream. Okay, next. Okay. And here is a micro finding, just to supplement what I said before. Okay, next slide, please. Supply chain. So the key is how to maintain stable supply chain. Manufacturing, transportation, and logistics. Yeah. We need to ensure this. So if the coal fired power plant disappear, then what is the replacement? It happened at the public or at the individual plant. I think we need very clear roadmap. Yeah? The most energy intensive sector, two, transportation and manufacturing. That this sector will be the key of the energy transition. Yeah, next. Okay, next. I think it has been explained excellently by Pak Sekjen. Yeah. Microdata. So the problem for manufacturing is they own their own genset. Some using diesel oil, some using coal. Perhaps that those are very big factory. So if the state, we can guarantee the reliability of the electricity, they may want to reduce the ownership of their own genset. Yeah. So at the macro, you have retiring the coal-fired power plant, and also at the micro level. So reliability is important. And then what happened at the more consumer side, at the private level? Electric vehicle, we know that infrastructure, recharging infrastructure is important. But what about reliability? We know that in Indonesia, there are 120 million of motorbike. It is a primary transportation tool in the countryside. So the farmer going to the rice field using their Japanese-made 1971 motorcycle still running. So what happened if they now have electric motorbike? Can they drive through the mud? Yeah. Okay, question, right? How waterproof is my new motorcycle? Next, urban people. I think the rate of adoption will be higher in the urban. First, because they use it to go to the office, to the market, and go to just to bring their family. But remember, in Indonesia, even cities are not immune to the flood, right? So the question is, how reliable? If I use my EV motorbike to drive across the flood, right? So the question again, reliability. And then the third one is that how you are going to recycle the battery. Again, the cost of ownership, right? The cost of ownership right now is still high, but it has related to the size of industry. Once you have minimum market size, I think the government has a target by 2025, about 20% of the motor vehicle will be powered by battery, right? I don't know whether that will be achieved or not. But I think the most important, particularly for Pertamina Energy, is to look at the tipping point. Because it looks slow, right? But remember, not very long time ago, we used cell phone, different brand name, different country, right? I'm not going to mention that name, right? Right now, look at your pocket. Look at your bag. Do you have that cell phone? No. You do not remember when you put that into retirement, right? I thought I remember 2010. That is my cell phone over there. So the tipping point will be very sudden. And right now, I'm going to tell you, we cannot use econometric, we can use statistics, we cannot use forecasting model. We can only use what we call data analytic and looking at the social media. You have no program called Python to observe what happened, right? At the very micro level. It may happen very suddenly. Suddenly people, driving electric motorbike is very cool. In the old days, when the boy visited his girlfriend's house, right? In bahasa ngapel, ngapel, I think they modified their exhaust pipe so the sound will be tremendous, right? Soaring, tremendous. It's sign that you are here. But in the future, silence is golden. The more silent your motorbike, the more confident you are. That is the energy transition in Indonesia. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Ari Kunchoro, for the excellent, very insightful presentation on the importance of energy transition, the supply chain, how it works, as well as how the transition in energy is all about investing and real, tangible investments in our future. And distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, next, it is also the greatest honor for us to invite to the stage Dr. Heri Harudin, the Vice President of Pertamina Energy Institute, to come up on stage to deliver his incredible presentation on the update of Pertamina Energy Outlook 2022. Let's give him a big round of applause.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good morning, everyone. On behalf of Pertamina Energy Institute, I would like to thank you for your coming here to joining us in this session. And I'm delighted to introduce our Pertamina Energy Outlook 2022. Terima kasih tadi kepada Bapak Perdana Mulyana yang sudah hadir dan memberikan keynote-nya, juga Profesor Ari dan juga Profesor Rakul. Dan juga kami ucapkan terima kasih kepada Ibu Bapak distinguished guest, Bu Vivi, Pak Agus Puji, dan juga banyak yang lainnya. Terima kasih atas kehadiran di dalam acara ini. So, I will to say that the Pertamina Energy Outlook is published annually by PEI as a result of PEI study on energy demand in Indonesia. And I will present condensed version of Pertamina Energy Outlook 2022, and hopefully this would give you insight and also useful for your work, for your business planning, and also for future business, and also considering risks and opportunities for the future business in the near future. So before we start with the energy outlook, I would like, next slide please. Before we start with the energy outlook, I would like to remind you current global situation. So Prof. Ari and also Professor Fakula maybe also has introduced that. We are currently facing multiple disruption and rising pressure on global cooperation towards climate goals, from climate crisis, conflict, and also COVID-19. Climate crisis brings disruption in many sectors, including energy. As what happened in Texas, India, China, and Europe last year, this crisis raises concern on energy resiliency. On the other side, geopolitical conflict raises concern on energy security too. This includes the security of critical mineral required for energy transition, which geographically concentrated on several countries only. So while COVID-19 has shifted global focus on recovery. So all this situation made us focus on the people, and economy, and energy security, and also resiliency. Next. However, we are still making progress thanks to the COP27 and also G20 in Indonesia, which is a successful meeting. The result from COP27 and G20 this year still show commitments in climate action. Climate crisis has made our global leaders shift climate action focus from mitigation to adaptation. This is to increase climate resiliency and to recover loss and damage caused by climate crisis. Another good news is that our global leaders are also committed to support climate financing, as introduced also by Prof. Ari. In the next two slides, I will remind all of us about our existential issues. So, first, let us look into the population of our planet Earth. Projection shows that Earth will carry additional 2 billion people in the next 30 years. That is 1.2 times Earth's current burden. We will need additional resources to support global population from food, clothing, housing, minerals, energy, and others. If we fail to manage, this fundamental issue may have many implications across the SDGs that we would like to achieve. Increasing poverty, loss of biodiversity, reduction on clean water are some of the examples that could happen. But we know that our planet resources is limited. Therefore, we need more sustainable living. However, these issues show that our resources will be disrupted by climate crisis. Here, from increasing extreme weather event, food security loss in agricultural sector, increasing sea level, and loss of ocean biodiversity, and many more. It could happen. Therefore, if we pass the climate target, there will be consequences for the next generation and our planet. Population burdens and the climate crisis show that not only do we need stronger policies and action to achieve our climate targets, but we also need a holistic cross-sectoral approach. This is to ensure that our action will not result in any other problem in the future. For the next 20 and 30 minutes, please allow me to present Pertamina perspective on Indonesia energy sector to 2060. Yeah. The Pertamina Energy Outlook provides 3 alternative perspectives on Indonesia energy sector outlook, affected by 3 different scenarios on global energy transition and temperature rise. Our scenario names are still similar to last year. We call it low energy transition, with low energy transition across the scenarios, and also market-driven as reference scenario, and green transition as the highest green energy transition across the scenarios. The low transition captured that in our recent situation where energy security and energy price inflation become a global issue. Therefore, the NZE target will not be achieved because government will focus on economic development using cheap energy sources. In this scenario, developing countries will have low green energy investment and the energy mix will be dominated by cheap and fossil energies. In this scenario, the renewable energy portion is only 21% in 2050. This scenario assumes that we will pass the climate target with global temperature increase around 3 degrees above the industrial level that we want to achieve. And we will face highest climate risk across all scenarios with more extreme weather even occurring in the future. And the second scenario is market-driven, still under similar doubt in global energy security and economic situation. However, global leaders still committed to climate target. Therefore, the pace of energy transition will be different in developed and developing countries. Developed countries will accelerate energy transition, and we can currently see that several developed countries recently announced energy transition policies, and we expect that those policies will be implemented in the future. However, in this scenario, we see that the developing countries are still focused on economic development and will catch up the energy transition post-2030. The global emission reduction will rely on carbon offsets such as natural-based solution, and also renewable portion in 2050 is 31%. So this scenario assumes that we will slightly pass our climate target with global temperature increase around 2.4 degrees. This scenario has increasing climate risk also, and extreme weather even. In green transition, although the name is green, NZE still achieved differently across countries. The NZE achievement is supported by accelerated technology development, regulation prioritization on NZE achievement. However, only leading countries achieve NZE target, including Indonesia. This will make us slightly miss 1.5 target, and the global temperature rise will be around 1.7. These are three scenarios that we we use. Our scenario are based on key trends in energy sector as follows. First, electrification. The electrification is happening in road transport, residential and commercial and industrial sector. However, the pace and magnitude is different across the scenarios. Sustainable fuel is also increasing. And we see several countries implemented biofuel blending, and there are development in synthetic fuel too, based on hydrogen. Under the current global situation, energy security and resiliency become focused. Gas is Indonesia's current best option to replace dirty coal while ensuring energy resiliency. We understand that nuclear could become option, but it requires stronger government support and also decision. Oil and gas are not only used for energy, but also for petrochemical feedstock. Petrochemical will drive oil demand in the future as our economy prefers packaging. However, recycling will slow down the demand growth. Hydrogen, recently gaining traction with several countries race to become hydrogen producer or hubs. In the future, hydrogen will be required for iron and steel industry, heavy road transportation, and also for the synthetic fuel production. Last but not least, recently carbon capture investment is also increasing, although it is still burdened by high cost, especially when it becomes economically viable and there are favorable regulations to support its development. So, the main driver for energy demand is economic growth and population. Indonesia's economy is predicted to grow by 5% for 2023. In the long term, Indonesia is expected to have sustainable growth until 2060 and hopefully beyond. And the GDP projection for 2060 is at a growth of 2.17. Indonesia's economic growth follows the long-term trajectory of developing countries, where economic growth tends to be slower as economy become more advanced. Population census in 2022 recorded population of Indonesia in 275 million, and by 2050 population will reach more than 300 million, and 2060 will reach 340 million. So, all this will drive the energy demand. Next. Next slide. Yeah, Okay. This slide shows our energy strategy in brief for each sector. Policy and green technology costs still become the key enabler for energy transition. So policy and green technology costs. For example, stronger policy in road transport, as also mentioned by Prof. Ari, could speed up electric vehicle sales and increase biofuel blending. CCS could reduce emission in the far future, but it requires economic viability. Hydrogen utilization in the industrial sector should be supported by production cost reduction, especially for green hydrogen. In residential, electrification of household, like electric cooking, could further reduce our reliance on biomass and LPG, creating equal access to technology for Indonesian people. We will further deep dive on each sector in the next few slides. But for that, let us see the brief overview of our primary energy demand. Okay, here are the scenario highlights for Indonesia primary energy demand. In low transition, fossil energy will remain strong. Oil will plateau after 2049 in the scenario. In market-driven, oil peak around 2038, and in green transition, oil peak earlier, which is 2025. This is caused by faster vehicle electrification and higher blending of biofuel. Gas has different story. On gas, in every scenario, gas demand will increase until 2060. However, in low transition, gas growth is not as high as market-driven and green transition because of the coal. Yeah, it's competitive with the coal. Therefore, if coal retirement accelerated, gas will be needed to replace coal, especially as base load in power sector and to ensure the energy resilience. In green transition post-2040, gas will grow stronger because supported by CCS and CCUS to reduce emission. We are fully aware that some of this gas portion could be replaced by nuclear in the future. However, again, nuclear development in Indonesia still requires clear government commitment, and until this day, Indonesia still lacks 3 out of 19 nuclear infrastructure regulation or issues from IEA. When there are clarity from government intention, nuclear will become solution for energy security and resiliency in the future in Indonesia. Renewable energy in every scenario increases because energy transition gaining traction nowadays, although the speed and magnitude will be different across the scenarios. Let us look at the primary energy mix. Renewable energy and bioenergy portion will increase in stronger energy transition scenario. But gas will also increase because it required to replace coal as baseload in electrification. In the lower part of this slide, we can see the emission. Yeah? In low transition, there's no peaks. The emission will always increase, aligned with the primary energy demand. But we can reduce emission although energy demand still increase in market-driven scenario. In market-driven scenario, there's slightly increase on emission. In this scenario, emission will peak 2045 and slightly increase afterward because increasing gas utilization to replace coal. So carbon offset also will be required in this scenario. In green scenario, emission will peak 2032 and slowing down afterward, but increase post-2040 because increasing gas and coal and the use of CCS. Then if you use CCS, then the emission could be reduced further to net zero. So we can see that CCS is very important in these scenarios. So how is the Indonesian final energy consumption mix? In final consumption, increasing electrification based on more stable green energies, gas and hydrogen utilization, also improving energy efficiency is required to reduce emission. Industry has the biggest challenge to reduce energy. So we see that for the industry, such as cement, iron, steel industry, to reduce is very, very hard. Yeah. industry is the upper, and the emission is the sector, the upper, yeah, the blue. And however, residential and transport has better chance to transition pushed by consumer side. Now let's see energy transition scenario per sector. We will begin with the road transport. Next, please. How we see the situation in transportation. To reduce emission, road transportation requires more electrification, sustainable fuel, and increasing efficiency, driven by, again, policy, feedstock availability, and lower cost in green transport technology. So we need access to technology that affordable. Electric vehicle mostly driven by policy to limit ban and ICE sales, internal combustion engine sales, and lower cost of battery. In low transition scenario, battery cost still above $100 per kilowatt hour. In market driven, battery cost is around 90 $90 per kilowatt hour. And meanwhile, in green transition, battery cost is around 70. So this will further increase electric vehicle sales, and the TCO of electric vehicle may be decreased. In low transition, limited road electrification will cause most people change their vehicle at home. It's about the charging. In market-driven, increasing road electrification will make private charging infrastructure become profitable, although most charging is still at home. This is based on current people behavior that prefer to charge at home because EV require time to charge. In green transition, stronger green commitment will make government to step in and invest charging infrastructure to push EV adoption, especially for fast charging. So next, if we see it on the biofuel blending could reduce Indonesia oil import reliability. Aside from electrification, stronger blending mandates will push biofuel utilization. But the utilization will be limited due to increasing electrification and feedstock availability and reliability. Indonesia food-grade biofuel is projected to have big role. This will raise food versus fuel issues. So. Further, in market-driven and green transition, heavy road transport will drive hydrogen demand in the future. In general, hydrogen supply must be supported by lower production costs of green and blue hydrogen, less than $2 per kilogram. Meanwhile, gray hydrogen costs will increase in the future and in line with the implementation of carbon price. So we need to have access on green and blue hydrogen that is affordable. Now, if we see on the lower left side, the lower left side here, we can see the SDG number 2, 7, 12, and so on. This is in our analysis on how energy transition in each sector will have positive impact or negative impact if it is not carefully managed to the SDGs. In road transport, energy transition will positively having impact in SDG 7 and 13. But food versus fuel should be managed so that it will not having adverse impact on the SDG number 2 on food security. EV battery production, including its full value chain, should be managed so that it will not having adverse impact on SDG 12, 14, and 15. And therefore, energy transition is not only about the energy transition. We have to look holistically to other SDGs to ensure that the energy transition will not creating another problem in the future. So, to reduce emission, road transportation requires more electrification. In market-driven and green transition, heavy road transport also, as I mentioned, need hydrogen demand. And how about the marine? In marine transportation, it will be dominated by HSVO and low sulfur fuel oil, and then also by LNG and LPG in market-driven scenario. In green transition, alternative fuels such as hydrogen and ammonia will find more use. Only very limited electric fleet in operation compared to the road transportation. The lower energy demand in marine aviation is driven by worldwide regulation and trend on fuel efficiency improvement. So in Indonesia, after still main fuel for aviation, and stronger regulation in market-driven will push after to be replaced by bioafter and synthetic fuel after 2040 maybe. So in green transition, SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, will increasingly in use, and also the efficiency could further reduce the demand. And let's us look into the power sector. In power sector, more energy mix is required to reduce emission, increase energy security, and resiliency is very important. As we can see, increasing electrification is required for emission reduction. The upper side of the slide shows the capacity required to generate power in the lower side of the slide. So the capacity mix and the generation mix. In market-driven and green transition, solar power capacity increase required energy storage support because of intermittency. So this is very important. In green transition, some portion of coal and gas power will be supported by CCS to reduce emission. So in the green transition, again, CCS is very important to achieve, to reduce emission. However, as we can see in market-driven scenario, solar power generation will be close to gas, in market-driven. But capacity required is more than double due to capacity factor. This means more critical mineral will be required to bring similar level of solar power generation compared to gas. Therefore, stronger policy is needed to ensure that the full value chain of solar panel production will not have negative impact on some SDGs. So next one, let's see into the industry. The main challenge in industrial sector is to reduce emission in hard to abate industries while ensuring energy resiliency. To reduce emission in industrial sector, electricity, low emission energy sources, and efficiency should increase. However, due to high intensity and resiliency requirement in industrial sector, electricity for industrial should come from non-intermittent energy sources. So here, nuclear maybe, we can see that nuclear energy is very important. In lower side of this slide, we can see that the pattern of primary emission in industrial sector is similar to coal consumption. This is the challenge of emission reduction in the industrial sector. However, the utilization of CCS could bring this emission goes down to achieve net zero. Then let's see the commercial and household energy outlook. How is the situation in household and commercial? In any scenario, commercial sector main energy consumption is from electricity, and it will further increase in the future. In the residential sector, higher electrification and gasification using city gas in the residential sector will make Indonesia to not only have a greener transition, but also better access to technology, as seen in the declining of biomass to increasing electric cooking and city gas. Therefore, electrification and providing gas to household is very important. That will give a positive impact to the SDG number 10. Finally, let us conclude the scenario implication and recommendation. Our scenario provides strategic level thinking on Indonesia energy transition, its driver and implication. In brief, policy and regulation still become the main driver of energy transition. This is also mentioned by Prof. Fakul and also by Prof. Ari. Furthermore, innovation to achieve technological breakthrough, incentive and disincentive mechanism and funding scheme is still required to reduce the cost. So government have to be involved in this program. However, under current global situation, Indonesia should also focus on 4 issues. First, Indonesia should develop roadmap and ensuring alignment across entities. Indonesia has a dream of Indonesia Emas 2045. and to take off from middle income trap. To achieve this dream, Indonesia requires economic growth supported by industrialization, agriculture, and services. Therefore, energy transition should be aligned with the economic development roadmap. This includes the development of green technology industry to support the economy. We are glad that today we will get also panelists from Bappenas. Yeah? And second, strengthen energy security and resilience. In energy sector, geopolitical risk has always existed, and green energy technology value chain is currently concentrated in several countries only. Indonesia, yeah, we have nickel. Meanwhile, increasing climate crisis and extreme weather even has been disrupted the energy sector. Therefore, we should ensure energy security and resilience in the energy transition to future-proof the energy sector from geopolitical and climate risks. Furthermore, the energy transition scenario is still in a wide plausibility. If energy transition policy and cost reduction in green technology is not as we expect, fossil fuel will reign. Therefore, we should also prepare for this scenario. Third, we have to accelerate energy transition in consumer side. Yeah, we always talk about the supply side. We have to accelerate energy transition in consumer side. Prof. Ari mentioned how important the behavior is. We really need incentive and disincentive to drive energy transition in consumer side, such as Ganjil Genap or maybe more stronger regulation or policy. Four, we should select the best green technology for Indonesia. Not the best that currently available, but the best that in the context of full value chain and life cycle for the economic growth in Indonesia. Therefore, the energy transition will give the best benefit for sustainability and also for the economy of Indonesia. However, the most important factor of all, we need global collaboration and partnership. We need collaboration and partnership to have access on finance, to have access on technology, because Indonesia net zero emission achievement without global net zero emission achievement will put all of us in the same climate danger. After all, we are all living in the same planet. So hopefully, by JETP and also another program with ADB, the acceleration of energy transition in Indonesia can be going well in the future. So that's my last, but not also this, next slide please. I would like to thank my team, the PEI team, who worked very hard to prepare this outlook, and the team also worked together across the function in holding and also sub-holding, and also in communication with all the stakeholders in the government, in also another LSM, non-government organization. And I hope this PO can contribute to all the attendants here, and can be used for the future work and also effort, and also can be discussed later to build a solid energy roadmap in Indonesia. Thank you very much for your attention. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.